to begin. Welcome. My name is Peter Cowie, and I am the Dean of the School of Global Policy and Strategy, which is the home of the 21st Century China program of UC San Diego. We meet for a night of thought and of celebration, but unfortunately and sadly, we are also meeting a day of tragedy, as we have all been learning about the terrible events in Paris. And so before we begin, I would like us to have a moment of silence for those who have lost their lives in Paris today. Thank you. Tonight we're exploring another one of the major challenges of this century, the question of the relationship between the United States and China. And the question, so to speak, before the House, although this is not a debate, is, are the United States and China headed toward a new Cold War? We have a panel, however, of warm relations, and let me introduce them before I hand it over to Susan Shirk. Sitting closest to me is Orville Schell, who is the Arthur Ross Director of the Center on U.S.-China Relations at the Asia Society in New York. Before he took on this position, he was the Dean of the School of Journalism at UC Berkeley. He's the author of 15 books, 10 of them about China, and a contributor to numerous edited volumes about the dynamics in China and the relationship between our two countries. Seated furthest away from me is Tom Christensen, who's the William Boswell Professor of World Politics of Peace and War and Director of the China and the World program at Princeton University. Tom, I thought we had copyrighted China in the name of academic programs. I think we'll have to have words afterwards. Tom, most recently, is the author of an important new book, The China Challenge, Shaping the Choices of a Rising Power. From 2006 to 2008, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs with responsibility for relations with China, Taiwan, and Mongolia. And that is a segue, naturally, to our colleague and friend, Professor Susan Shirk, who held that position in regards to China in the Clinton administration, who is the leader of our 21st Century China program and has been one of the most distinguished scholars of both the domestic politics of China and China in global relations, particularly in regards to the United States. Tonight is celebrating Susan because after years of service at UCSD in all capacities, teaching, research, service, she has, at this moment, chosen to become Professor Emeritus, but not to ride off into the sunset, but instead to charge into the rising sun with her leadership full-time of the 21st Century China program, and for that we are deeply grateful. So tonight, again, is a moment of celebrating Susan, but it is also a moment for thoughtful contemplation about one of the most significant issues facing us in the 21st century. And with that, let me hand this over to Susan Shirk by first giving her a round of applause.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. I'm very excited and honored that Tom Christensen and Orville Schell have taken the time out of their very busy schedules to come and join me here on this panel today. I should also mention that two of my former students, who are themselves important China scholars and experts on U.S.-China relations, Jessica Weiss, who's at Cornell, and I think Sui-Sheng Zhao, oh, there he is, Sui-Sheng Zhao, who's back there from University of Denver. They're in the audience. It's too bad we only have an hour because you would love to hear from them too. And I introduce them now because you may want to try to catch them afterwards to get their perspective on these issues. I'm the one who picked the provocative title of this panel because it's something I lie awake at night worrying about. And I'm worried about it because I see the relationship between the United States and China growing increasingly competitive. Very different from the feeling that we had when I was working in government from 1997 to 2000. Basically, every administration since Nixon has pursued the same basic approach to China, which is try to find some basis for cooperation, build a foundation for a constructive relationship despite the huge differences in our values and our political system. And while at the same time maintaining a position of military strength in the Asia Pacific through our alliances, through our forward deployed forces, as a hedge if our efforts at engaging China were unsuccessful. So that's basically been the approach we've taken, and up until about 2009, I would say, it looked like this was working very, very well. China was working hard to reassure us and the neighbors, the Asian neighbors who surround it, as well as the rest of the world, that it was not a threat as it became more powerful economically and militarily. And so it really bent over backwards to not be a bully, to be cooperative, and it changed its behavior in the region and globally in substantial ways, so we could feel that our engagement policy was really working. But in the past few years, it hasn't been such a clear picture. The picture is now mixed. On the one hand, at the global level, there's still substantial cooperation with China. Although China doesn't like to take the lead globally in international organizations, we're able to cooperate, for example, in preparations for the Paris Climate Agreement. And there are other on non-proliferation, on Iran. This has been things that we can point to as signs that China isn't really trying to necessarily supplant the United States as the leading global power and wants to work within the international order. But within the Asia-Pacific region is where the biggest problems are. And a lot of it comes down to China's starting to place its maritime sovereignty disputes as a higher priority than its own national security. And especially with Japan and the East China Sea, but also in the South China Sea, it has started to emphasize showing resolve instead of trying to reassure its neighbors. And of course, if it continues to elevate these sovereignty disputes, that is a formula for continued friction and tension with its neighbors and with the United States. So that's why its actions on these disputes are interpreted by us and by other countries as some negative implication for what kind of rising power we're dealing with. It doesn't look like a country that is trying to work well with others and reassure others about its intentions. The other thing that is quite disturbing right now is trends inside China. where Xi Jinping, the current leader of China, is emphasizing you might say, the Cold War inside China, the struggle with Western values, universal values, and drawing a very bright line between Chinese values, by which he means a kind of mixture of Maoism and Confucianism, and Western values. And there's an intense anxiety about Western subversion of China and intensification of ideological education, ideological criticism, and of course a strengthening of internet and media censorship and building up the Great Firewall even higher. So the combination of these two things, plus a very concerted effort to coerce Western companies into transferring technology to China in order to build up China as an innovative power, a technological power, a form of import substitution, high-tech industrialization. The result of that is our companies have become very disaffected from China. And our large companies used to be the main domestic constituency for this engagement policy that we've carried out for so many administrations. So that means that it's much more difficult for our government to pursue an engagement policy because that constituency is no longer there. So that's kind of my scene setter. That's the situation, and I think many of us who have worked so hard on understanding China and on carrying out a good U.S. policy toward China over many years are now struggling ourselves with trying to question, should we just keep doing more of the same, or do we need to modify our approach to China in some substantial ways? So let's start by hearing from Tom Christensen, his views on the question.
This is on. Great. I guess I can just sit here, and I don't need to go up to the podium. Well, before I say something about whether there's going to be a new Cold War with China, I wanted to say something about Susan. She is my role model. I'm not being sappy when I say that. She is a great scholar of China. She is a great public servant, both in the government and outside the government. And she's what doesn't get noticed so easily is she is a very generous colleague and mentor for her students, but also to people like me, with whom she had no institutional connection, has always supported my career as a scholar, and perhaps most important, before I became Deputy Assistant Secretary, I sought advice from all the people who held that position in the past, and nobody was more generous with her time and more wise in her counsel than Susan. I've just benefited greatly from the conversations we had. Now, I have to do my job, but I could praise you all night, but I'll praise you again. I hope I did come here for that. And if I get a chance later, I'll praise you again. But is there going to be a new Cold War was the question that was asked. My answer is a very simple one. No, there's not going to be a new Cold War. But that's where the good news ends. There's not going to be a new Cold War because we don't have a zero-sum view of our relations with China like we did with the USSR. And it's unlikely that we're going to have zero-sum views of our relations with China in the near term. So if you look at our economies, we're both among the top 2 trading partners of the other side. I think in the last month, actually, China became our biggest export market for a while, probably because of oil prices. But that's quite significant as a target of investment on both sides now and in both directions. It's obvious that we don't have a zero-sum relationship. And then if you see the degree of concern in China when the U.S. economy turns down and the degree of concern in the United States when the Chinese economy turns down, you realize that this isn't a Cold War, because we celebrated when the Soviet economy suffered, during the Cold War, and they celebrated when our economy suffered. We wished each other no good outcomes at all, and this isn't the case in the U.S.-China relationship, and it won't be for quite a long time. And even on diplomacy, as Susan said, we have these common interests in various issues around the world. We don't always agree on strategy, and I'll get to that, but we obviously have some common interests, and it is the case that the U.S. government across administrations, across parties, have encouraged China to play a larger role on the international diplomatic stage, not a smaller role, which is pretty much the opposite of our treatment of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So it's a very different environment. So that's when the good news ends and the real challenges rise. And I did write a book, so I'm not trying to sell the book here. What I'm trying to do is say, here are some of the themes that I lay out in the book in more detail if you're interested in seeing more flesh on the bones. I really see two challenges, one on the security front and one on the global governance front. And the security challenges, as Susan said so well, really relate to East Asia in particular, the region around China. As countries rise, they rub up against their neighbors in new ways. And to be fair to China, to say I'm not picking on China in particular here, if China handles its relations with its neighbors as it rises as badly as the United States did in the late 19th century, we're in for big trouble. And some of the same factors are there. They're not all the same. But the idea is that we fought a major war with Spain that was totally unnecessary. It followed by a large counterinsurgency war in the Philippines, largely because of domestic instability in the United States, jingoism, and not being used to being a great power and how to handle your diplomacy as a great power, sort of adolescent phase in our foreign policy. And you can see all of those things in China. They're rubbing against their neighbors in new ways. They don't have experience abroad, especially at sea, and they have jingoism at home along nationalist grounds. So I'm not picking on China, but I'm worried about it. And I don't think China is going to be a country that tries to drive the United States out of East Asia. I don't see any persistent evidence for that thesis. I don't see any persistent evidence for the thesis that China is likely to become a global peer competitor or surpass the United States for global leadership anytime soon. But I do see China as already strong enough with its power projection capabilities and its asymmetric capabilities vis-a-vis the United States to destabilize East Asia. And East Asia matters a lot to us. And that capability is only going to grow. And while this is not a new Cold War, in some ways it's more complicated than the Cold War was, at least after 1962 and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Why do I say that? Cold War was nasty. We shouldn't celebrate it. We shouldn't look back on it with any kind of nostalgia. But it was in some ways more simple than what we have in East Asia today. And that after 1962, in most places of the world, we knew where the lines were between the two camps, the geographic lines. So we knew what aggression would look like. And we know from human psychology, from Nobel Prize-winning work by Tversky and Kahneman, that most humans across genders and cultures and places will take bigger risks and pay bigger costs to defend what they believe is legitimately theirs, the legitimate recognized status quo, than they will to get new stuff. And there have been exceptions in history. Hitler, thank God he was an exception. But there have been exceptions in history. But most places, most people have this tendency. And in the Cold War, that was a stabilizing factor because the anti-communist alliance knew if it went into Eastern Europe aggressively with conventional forces, that would be very aggressive and very destabilizing. And the communist forces knew that if they went into Western Europe, and the lines were pretty clear with the exception of West Berlin. In East Asia, that's not the case. There is no consensus view on what the legitimate status quo is. And one of the things that worries me most about the East Asian region is I talk to diplomats from the various countries that have these overlapping claims, and people in this audience will be familiar with the overlapping claims. They all seem sincere. That's what worries me most. They all really believe this stuff is theirs and that the other countries are unreasonable, right? That's the worst possible situation to manage from the perspective, of course, of diplomacy, because they're all more likely to take higher risks and pay higher costs to defend what they believe is legitimately theirs. And I almost wish they were lying and were aggressors, because that would be easier to deter. So that's a big mess. And in addition, China's coercive capability that they're developing, and I can't go into details, overlaps dangerously with the nuclear capabilities that they're developing. And that has potential for escalation that I'm quite concerned about. So the new ability to get offshore with Chinese force is based on two systems that overlap with the new nuclear modernized systems. And those are road mobile, solid fueled, conventionally tipped missiles and submarines. and the modernized nuclear force is built on the same kind of spine. So that means that if the United States military in a conflict or crisis with China does what it has done around the world in the last couple of decades, which is to try to, in a very early on, cripple the capabilities of the other force to put at risk our forward deployed forces, they might be taking on forces that overlap with the nuclear force of China with potentially escalatory capacity. And no president has launched that kind of attack against any nuclear power, let alone one that has overlapping systems. So that's a cause for concern for the United States. The second challenge is not the security challenge, it's the global governance challenge. And I actually think from a US foreign policy perspective, it's a bigger challenge. And that is how to get China to contribute constructively and persistently to handle these various issues around the world that touch the interests of all the great powers, including China and the United States. These global governance issues like non-proliferation, like handling regional instability and humanitarian crises, civil conflicts around the world, financial stability, maintaining financial stability, and climate change, which is a big one. And the problem here that I see, and I try to outline in the book, is the world is more globalized and more integrated than ever before. So the comparisons to World War I don't work. So don't believe the realist scholars when they bring this up. It's much more tightly integrated than ever before, and that's demonstrable. So all the great powers have to pull in a positive direction to solve most of these major problems. And if any of them buy out, either as an obstructionist force, which would be terrible, or even as a free rider, it's very difficult to solve those problems. So on an issue like non-proliferation, the Chinese economy is large enough now that if China maintains normal relations with North Korea or Iran under a sort of snapback scenario in the future, then it's going to be very difficult for the rest of the world to pressure those regimes effectively. They can rely almost entirely on one actors' sustenance. And here's the problem. China is a big, great power in this regard, a giant economy, but it's still a developing country. And it's a developing country with a lot of domestic problems. They recognize, the government in China recognizes it has these domestic problems, with a giant post-colonial nationalist chip on its shoulder, to boot. And that country has to pull in a positive direction with these other countries. And never before has the world asked a developing country to contribute to solving far-flung problems in the way that China is being asked today. And in the book, I point out that China in 2012, the last year I had good data, by the most expansive definition of the Chinese GNP, on a per capita basis, China's per capita GNP was the same as Ecuador's. Nobody's asking Ecuador to solve problems in far-flung places. The reason we're asking China to do it is there's 1.3 billion Chinese, and the Chinese economy is huge. But it's a difficult problem. And we're going to ask more and more, and that's going to cause friction in the US-China relationship when China doesn't come through, because China is going to be blamed for X, Y, and Z not working out, and China will undercut efforts of other states who on a domestic basis will say, why should we sacrifice anything while China free rides on any issue, whether it be climate change or anything else. So if you look at the arguments about climate change in the United States domestically, when people say, why shouldn't we do more? They say, why should we do more when China's polluting so much? It's an easy out, and these problems are hard enough without easy outs. And then the Chinese have a good response. On a per capita basis, we're doing much less pollution than you are. Historically, we've done less than you have, and this is a new thing, and we're growing. So it's a tough problem to handle. I'm not saying it's a problem of faults per se. I'm saying very difficult diplomatic challenge for the United States. And I'll just close by saying, why did this really happen from the period that Susan outlined so well from 2009 to the present? And I think this is something we have to realize, is that the financial crisis really made this problem much worse. And it did it for two separate reasons, and they're both bad from the perspective of trying to solve either the security challenge or the global governance challenge that I laid out. And that is, this financial crisis made China more confident abroad and the Chinese government less confident at home at the same time. So we're bigger and stronger. We can do more things. We don't have to take it as much as we did before because we're stronger now because the United States has shot itself in the foot several times and its allies have suffered as well, and we've weathered the storm pretty well. And at the same time, we don't know if our economic model is going to continue to produce the jobs. We have to restructure in ways that we're not sure are going to work out, and we're more concerned than ever about social instability. And if you think about a 2x2 table like a political scientist, and Susan is a political scientist like I am, so if you think about it as a 2x2 table, the worst cell in the 2x2 table for the challenges that I outline is a China that is overly confident abroad and overly afraid at home. And that's what I basically see since 2009 when the financial crisis set in China. And that's why I think, to be fair, because people ask me this, I was in the Bush administration, why when U.S.-China relations were good in the Bush administration and the region was relatively stable when the Bush administration left office, and now U.S.-China relations are more tense and the region is less stable, why isn't this the Obama administration's fault? And I say, well, that's too simplistic, that analysis. The China the Obama administration has been dealing with is not the same China that the Bush administration deal with. And you have to tackle these problems from a fair perspective. And I can criticize the policies of any administration, and I can praise the policies of any administration. But I think from a macro perspective, you have to realize that the China that the Obama administration has been dealing with is a tougher China to deal with than previous administrations have. And I'm done. I think I've probably gone on for too long, but they did ask an academic to come. But again, this show is about Susan, and I say role model. I don't mean that I am matching her career. I'm just thinking role models should be up in the stratosphere, and you should try to get as close as you can to make yourself better. And that's all I see myself doing in my own career. She really is terrific, and I'm really honored to be here today.
Thank you.
Well, so it's wonderful to be here, Susan, with you. It's your investiture of this medal. And I've, over the years, done many, many projects with Susan, and we're engaged in a big one right now. So it's been a long and really nice collegial relationship. And I have to say, being here, San Diego, I mean, I spent a lot of my life around 3 or 4 big other universities. And, I don't think there is another university that's quite managed to galvanize a critical mass of sort of interesting faculty and graduate students and fellows and whatnot the way San Diego has. And I think the 21st Century China Project is sort of the heart and soul of that, so good work. Listen, it occurs to me, listening to Tom and Susan and hearing the really horrible news from Paris, if you look at the world, I think it's fair to say that ISIS is really out of play. We don't know what to do about it. Russia, I think, has sort of fallen off the conveyor belt. We can't find the reset button on Russia anytime soon. It's really sort of lost for now in terms of establishing a constructive relationship. That is not true yet of China. But as both of my colleagues have suggested, alas, I think we are headed in an untoward direction. I think that most of the signs, there's some positive signs, but there are an awful lot of new things which have surprised us. And when I say surprised us, what I mean to say is that during our lifetimes, we have, I think, had the privilege of being able to presume, without being, I think, too deluded, that if we just kind of kept with what we're doing, more exchanges, more cultural interactions, more WTO, all of the things which have gone on, slowly the US and China would converge rather than diverge. And we were speaking in Susan's office before, about this. It's a rather quaint notion that actually history is moving in some direction, and it's ineluctable, it's unstoppable. It's Hegel, even Marx, but that ultimately it's all going towards greater openness. And I think the tragedy of 1989, and I spent all those weeks there, and I felt intoxicated by the feeling of openness and sort of freedom and euphoria that gripped China at that time. But it ended that sort of dream. That in actuality, we're all headed in the same direction. Give us time, China used to say. Historically speaking, China has always had a kind of a phased sense of how history would move. You'd have military dictatorship, guided democracy, constitutionalism. Everybody sort of assumed that that was the pattern. I think we have come to a point, for reasons which would be very interesting for us to discuss a bit, where I don't really see that quite so clearly and so hopefully. China, particularly under Xi Jinping, has come to a different sort of a interregnum, where I don't think they even aspire to getting where it was that we all thought the world in general should go, was going. Do you remember the end of history? And then we had the end of history. And then a rather curious thing happened in regard to China. I think China began to say, in effect, we're not headed in your teleological direction. And this is where we see entering the stage of the whole drama of China's development, the notion of the China model. That in fact, their end goal is really different from our end goal. And this complicates our relationship in the most profound way. And then if you feed into this equation the narrative in China, America has its narrative, I won't get into it here, which I think in many ways is very outdated. And that is the narrative of historical victimization, which engenders a tremendous amount of paranoia. That the West is beat up on China, preyed upon China, Japan occupied China, we grabbed concessions in Shanghai and treaty ports, we didn't treat China very well. This was the gift of Vladimir Lenin to Sun Yat-sen, to Mao Zedong, even to Chiang Kai-shek, that China had been abused by the West. And I'm not denying it, but I'm only saying that out of that sort of historical understanding came the China narrative of China the humiliated and China the victimized. And it means that there is a sort of almost autonomic psychological mindset, in my view, and I think it's come much more to the fore in the last few years, of that it engenders a certain amount of paranoia about the intentions of the West. Not that our intentions are always so great, not that we haven't made some serious mistakes, diplomatic and otherwise, gone to war when we shouldn't, et cetera, but that there is a kind of an irresistible tendency within China to impute rather unpleasant motives to what the West does. Susan mentioned this rejection of universal values, the rejection of things so fundamental as human rights. I mean, what human being on earth wants to defend locking people up unjustly? Really, no human being should. That is a kind of a universal value. It isn't a provincial value. It is rejected in China. And so this narrative, I think, makes it very difficult for me to see how these two nations, the two most consequential, only really consequential nations in the world today, are going to get along. We're fired up by increased distrust rather than more trust. And that does not bode well for our future. So I find these things very troubling. There's one I'd like to end on a slightly brighter note. Because I do think, actually, as I said in the outset, China is not out of play. China has a deep and abiding fascination, indeed love and some hatred for the United States, unlike Russia. There is a very complicated sort of legacy to play upon. But I think if we've lost the common interest that brought Kissinger and Nixon to China, which was the Soviet Union, if we've lost the common interest that we were all sort of historically headed in the same direction, but it would take China a lot longer than France or Canada or the United States, there is a new common interest, and Tom alluded to it, that's on the horizon, and that is the challenge of climate change. And we do see President Xi and President Obama having come together at APEC a year ago, again at the summit meeting a month or two ago, and now in Paris, God knows what will happen to the UN conference on climate change now with these horrible attacks. But the promise was that that fabric would be knitted even a little more completely. So if you assay the things where we have common interest, you do come up with some areas such as climate change, pandemics, nuclear proliferation, trade, there is a basis for the two countries to get together. If, in fact, I think these other kind of imponderables like the narratives of each country, the mutual distrust, the narratives of suspicion don't overwhelm us and sabotage us. And I think Susan's absolutely right. China is unfamiliar because it hasn't been negotiating the world in the way that the world has become accustomed to being negotiated of late. And it's learning, and it's making some mistakes, and it's becoming belligerent and truculent in a way which I think may feel good because it's a sign of its new wealth and power, but it is not going to help it in the long run, I think, reach any accommodation with other powers in the world, which it must do if it's going to survive and if we're going to solve these other very daunting challenges which confront us all. So that's a mixed bag. I'm not particularly optimistic, I have to tell you. But I think there's no choice but for everybody to put their shoulder to the wheel in every conceivable way to see if we can't straighten this thing out before possibly China goes the way of Russia. And that would be a very sorry conclusion. So I'll stop here.
Well, our schedule is kind of tight tonight, and we only have an hour. So I will resist the, I guess I would like to ask one question. I'll ask one question, and then, I know, it's my night. Go ahead. So, Orville, well, I guess I'll ask Tom. Tom, do you think that the domestic trends inside China are differences in kind or differences in degree? And do you think that they call for a different approach on the part of the United States, as Orville is suggesting? Or do you think that, you know, they've been there before and we can work things out despite the differences in our values and politics?
I don't think we should change our approach to the problems. I think they've gotten worse. The problems have gotten much more intense under President Xi than they were in the previous leadership's. I don't want to say administration. I'll say regime under Hu Jintao. But they were bad then. The system has problems, but the way that the United States should deal with them shouldn't change. I think we learned through our own foreign policy history towards China and just through common logic that to deal with human rights abuses in China or anywhere else, not anywhere else, but especially in a country like China with which we have very robust economic relations, that the threat of material sanctions against the country is not the way to go. So even though the problems have gotten worse, it doesn't make that policy lever any more desirable as a choice, as a tool. So once you accept that, all you can do is engage directly with the Chinese and explain why you think this is A, wrong and in violation of human rights agreements that China has signed on to, and B, is not an effective way for China to stabilize its own country over time, and that it will lead to more instability. And I think a very compelling case can be made that if you really want to fight corruption, something that President Xi has said is necessary for the regime to survive. It's pretty extraordinary when a regime says, if we don't solve this problem, we're going down. Not that many governments do that, but Xi Jinping has said, we don't solve the corruption problem, we're going down. And if you take that and say, okay, you say there's this huge corruption problem, how is preventing investigative journalism, preventing rule of law, independent courts, and preventing lawyers from defending human rights advocates in any way going to help you solve your corruption problem? And then to constantly convey, and this is something I think the U.S. government doesn't do quite as well as it could, is to say to the Chinese that it's not simply because you owe it to the world to do this, but that instability in China, if you go down this road, it's going to cause more instability. Instability in China is our biggest nightmare in the United States. It would be a much bigger set of challenges if China were fundamentally unstable than if China were strong. We're pretty good at dealing with strong, unified actors. We have no capacity. You've served in the government, I served. We have no governmental capacity to deal with a collapsing China. So when we give that advice that to be stable, from our experience around the world, to be stable over the long run, you need to open up your society. You need to have constructive criticism that doesn't get punished. That leads to stability, and we wish you well on that score because instability in China would be a nightmare for us. I think that's something we need to convey. But no, I don't think we changed the basic strategy. And the last thing I'd say is this idea that since things are not working out well, because it's more competitive on the security front and the human rights conditions have declined in the last few years, and I believe both of those things are true, that we have to change strategy, isn't the proper lens to judge strategy. The way to judge strategy is, here's the set of policies we have, and they're a complex mix, and we can adjust the mix at any given time. And I think this mix that we have is the right mix, and we have to adjust the mix at the time and maybe put more onto the coercive side when necessary, do more things with our military when necessary. But you have to ask, what is better than that set? Even when that set isn't working out. Because in policy, your choices are often bad, worse, and catastrophically terrible. Right? Not silver bullet, rock to be thrown, and something else, right? There's very rarely that silver bullet. And the policy set that we have, I keep hearing, we need to rethink it. Well, rethink it and tell me your answer before I change it. Because I'm pretty sure the mix of policies we have in some combination is likely to be the best set that we have available to us until I'm told otherwise, right? And convinced otherwise. I want to stick with that mix and just adjust the combinations given the conditions. Will it work? It'll work better than the other stuff, and that's what policy is all about. Coming up with the best ideas that are available, not the silver bullets. We don't have that many silver bullets. That's a long answer.
So one question for Orville, then we'll open it up. So you have written books, not just about China's views of the West and Chinese history and its goals and especially wealth and power, but you've also written books about American misperceptions of China, including a great book on Tibet. So do you feel that now in the United States, in our own domestic context, we have the right perceptions of China, or are we also seeing China through a glass darkly?
Well, I think the word that stuck out when I was just listening to your comments was the right mix. And I think, the United States has also a mix of views about China. If you look on our China file with an F.com website, you will see a place there where every utterance that every presidential candidate has made about China is up. And you can troll through the Donald's various, scriptural utterances on the topic, and it's pretty astounding. But he speaks for one side of, the American psyche. But there is another side, and that is the side which is more rational and actually which takes the idea of American leadership seriously. And so we have all kinds of different views of China, some really crazy and some incredibly sane. But on the sane side, I'd like to think that everything is in what is the proper mix. And I would say that I think now, since things really have changed, China is much more powerful. It's much more aggressive, much more forward. It's expanding out in some ways which are terrific and acceptable, in some ways which I think are unacceptable. And I think what we need to do is sort of up the ante, not change the policy in some radical way, but change the mix. And I think what needs to be changed is, in effect, to say, you are going to be challenged militarily and in other ways if you continue to deport yourself as you have in the South China Sea, and there's some other examples of this. On the other hand, I think we need to keep the door wide open, encourage them, and express in every way conceivably possible that we'd like to have this thing work out, and we'd like to collaborate in every way possible. In other words, in Mao's famous language, to walk on two legs. But I think one leg of late has become a little bit of a kind of a lame appendage, and that is the resistance, because we have not had to resist China. And I think that's the part that we're beginning to reconsider. And I think if I read Washington correctly, particularly Secretary of Defense Ash Carter, he's saying, well, we've reached a point here where something needs to happen, and we'll see what happens. But I think China does understand power.
So first of all, on behalf of all of us, I want to thank Tom and Orville for joining us in this both terrific panel and the celebration of Susan. They were two people that she had a special passion for joining in this conversation, and you can see why. But I want to take a second at the close because we do have many of our students here tonight to share with them something that may otherwise slip by their attention, which is today UC San Diego honored 3 of our faculty members with the highest honor that can be given by the campus to faculty. This honor is called the Revelle Medal. It is given to people who best symbolize the qualities of the founder of UC San Diego, Roger Revelle, a world-class scholar, a person of great influence on world affairs. In many ways, he was the moving force in creating the research team that created the definition of global climate change, and also a person who was an institution builder and a thought leader in creativity. And so it was completely wonderful for all of us at the School of Global Policy and Strategy and everyone associated with the 21st Century China program that today Susan Shirk received the Revelle Medal, and I have it here. And Susan, as we close, let's give her a round of applause as she takes it.